Well, the centre of Kiev has become something of a battlefield over the past few days, as you've seen on our video footage. Now, this is Independence Square. It's known as Maidan. It's the main hub of the protests, and that's where the opposition camp is right now. But some of the most fierce clashes on Wednesday broke out on this nearby street. Now, tires were set alight there, and you just heard RT's Peter Oliver reporting from the scene. And 2 people were killed, both reportedly with bullet wounds. And the authorities, however, say police on the streets do not have live ammunition. And there do appear to have been vigilantes with firearms among the protesters, as you can see here in this picture. Well, let's talk more about what's happening there in Ukraine with Daniel McAdams. He's head of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity. Daniel, the EU is really putting pressure now on Kiev. Do you think this further intervention could perhaps ease the deadlock there?
No, I think the further intervention will make things worse. The reason why the protesters, if that's what they're to be called, have become more radicalized is because they've been encouraged all along by EU and American politicians who have been on the ground in the middle of the protests encouraging them. And that's simply unprecedented. It's unprecedented interference in a sovereign nation. And maybe there are 2 million people in Kiev, and maybe a percentage of them are protesting, but there are another 40 million people in Ukraine. How is there any democratic legitimacy to have a mob on the streets demanding new elections?
It's really got ugly, hasn't it, in the last day or so? 2 people confirmed dead, over 200 injured. Who's to blame for the violence from what you can gather? Is it the police or the protesters?
Well, certainly the protesters are to blame. The police are using violence. That's what police do everywhere when they have to break up protests like this. There's certainly plenty of blame that goes to EU and American politicians, like the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland, who is handing out cookies on the square. As we all know, her husband is the great neocon Robert Kagan, who's in favor of revolutions all over the world, a former advisor to John McCain. So these people know all about revolutions, and they're all in favor of them, and they have to share some of the blame for the bloodshed.
Well, the Western media has been largely laying the blame on the police.
Pictures show riot police shooting at protesters who tore down the barricades.
And we're reading that the Washington Post is claiming that the police were seen aiming rifles. Why would they assume, do you think, they were using live rounds and not rubber bullets on this occasion?
Well, it is interesting. We'll have to find out more about these apparent sniper deaths. We've seen in many of these previous protests, we saw it in Iran, for example, there seem to be these mysterious snipers who seem a lot more like provocations, if you ask me, but perhaps it's too early to tell.
And of course, much of the provocation is being blamed by the authorities on militants, on extremists. Who are these people? It's almost like a third party has emerged here in all of this. Who are they?
Well, there's an interesting symbiosis, isn't there, between people like Klitschko, who is seen in the U.S. as lionized in the U.S. as this great opposition leader, and these radical provocateurs in the street who are setting policemen on fire, throwing grenades at policemen, throwing rocks at them. Where in the world would this be tolerated? And it's all blamed on this new protest law. And this protest law is virtually identical to any law you would see here in the United States, for example. You're not allowed, I'm here in D.C., you're not allowed to wear a mask at a protest in Washington, D.C. You're not allowed to erect a tent. You saw what happened to the Occupy protests, violently torn down. You're not allowed to have foreign funding of your political organization here in the U.S. It's illegal. In Poland, one of the most arrogant of the countries interfering in Ukraine, condemning this new law. Well, if you libel a politician in Poland, you can go to jail for 2 years. So there's an enormous amount of hypocrisy involved here.
Just briefly and finally, Daniel, Yanukovych is in serious trouble. There is talk of perhaps a revolution. But what is the answer? Is a snap election, an early election, the answer to stop this violence?
Well, I've been an election monitor for a number of years in the 90s in many contentious areas. You simply cannot hold elections in an environment of violence like this. It's virtually impossible to do.
Daniel McAdams, thank you very much indeed. Head of the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Prosperity live in the States. Really appreciate your time and thanks for talking to us.